Stefano. Hello, I am Charlotte, and as Anna says, I come to you as an imposter because I'm not a historian. I am an archaeologist slash forensic scientist. So today, what I'm hoping to introduce to you is a series of kind of colonial cold cases to show you how we are using material evidence and evidence from the bones to kind of complement what we know about colonial Otago from the historical side of things. So hopefully it'll be a new area for some of you. For some of you it won't because you helped with the digs. But for others of you, hopefully I can give you a bit of insight into the other side of the fence, maybe, in terms of our understanding of New Zealand's colonial past. So this is probably stuff that's going to be familiar to everybody, the basic history of the settlement of Otago. But in case it isn't, the formal settlement of Otago begins in about 1848 when we get Ngāi Tahu and the Otago land laws coming through. But the interesting period for me and for our study is the Otago gold rushes. So in late 1861, Gabriel Reid finds gold in Tuapeka, later called Lawrence, and we get this influx of gold seekers from Europe, sometimes via California and Australia, and then later on we get people coming in from China. And that initial rush at Tuapeka, Lawrence is followed by other offshoot rushes, and then obviously later on we move over to Westland and Otago region becomes less of the gold rush centre. So today I'm going to focus on these colonial settlers who came over during these gold rush periods. I do want to acknowledge that obviously this was not the first settlement of Central Otago, and that Māori occupation was in the region from about 1300 AD. But during this period, Māori burial grounds and urupa are completely separate from the European burial grounds. So the individuals that I work with are buried in the European and Chinese cemeteries. So I don't know much about individuals on the Goldfields who were Māori, but I know they were there and they were a really important part of society, but I don't have any evidence from them, so I'm not going to talk on that today. So from the historical records, we have a good idea of some aspects of life on the Goldfields. So we have all these lovely pictures, which you'll see, some of which are from the Hocken, some from like the Alexander Turnbull Library, of men at work. And it is primarily men at work, European men, Chinese men later. And so we get this sort of pioneering image of guys doing it tough out on the Goldfields. Women are there too, promise, work that out. But they get less of a mention in the historical records in general. And children are there too, see, there's one. But they are sort of seen and not heard. Certainly they're not writing anything down themselves. So historical records can tell us some things for sure and give us some beautiful images of what life was like at the time. When we jump into archival work and evidence that we have from this time period of what is going on, there's loads of great evidence for lots of really fun bureaucratic things that are happening. So you get lists upon lists of people who've been appointed as postmasters and road committees. Now this probably makes some of your hearts sing. For me, it's not my love. And I find it really hard to identify with these people and to identify with the past when it's lists upon lists of names. On the other side of the coin, we get people who are scandalous. They get reported on. So from people embezzling in Mosgiel, I've just picked out some of my favourites. People embezzling in Mosgiel to sly grog sellers. I love a sly grog seller on the Otago Goldfields. They're some of my favourite people to read about. But they do have this kind of scandalous aspect to them, which makes them great for salaciously reporting on in the newspapers, but maybe not a great representation of everyday life for people. Side note, I have a great love for trying to trace people, particularly women, through the historical records because they often don't get much of a look in. And so I do a lot of going down rabbit holes of trying to follow certain women's stories through time. So just as an example of a woman who was considered scandalous, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jane Wilson from Cromwell, who I found while looking for evidence of another woman. So she's one of these scandalous ladies, and her story is kind of typical that the newspapers would like to report on from the time period. So I found her first in 1868, where she was arrested for vagrancy, which is often a code word for prostitution in this time period. So no fixed abode, therefore probably prostitution, and exposing liquor for sale. So she doesn't have a premises. She's just sort of opening up the coat. Anybody want some of this? But by 1870, she's got a premises. So she's gone up in the world and is arrested for sly grog selling. But she's not actually convicted because everyone there says, that wasn't grog, that was peppermint tea that we were drinking. In 1873, she was arrested for disorderly conduct on her premises. Her and another lady got drunk, got half naked and started fighting. The newspaper reports on that are very salacious. You can tell that the reporters had an absolute field day. In 1874, she's arrested for sly grog selling again. Once again, everybody says, no, that wasn't grog. Peppermint tea, we love it. She's actually convicted for sly grog selling in 1883. And in 1884, she's arrested again, but she gets off because her lawyer points out they're trying to try her in the wrong district, so they can't make a conviction. And then she sort of disappears. But this is the kind of trail that scandalous ladies leave, right? I like to think of her as kind of an entrepreneur. She starts out with a very small business, then she gets a tent, then she's sort of working through with her regular clientele. And these are the ladies that we hear most about. But people who had more everyday lives, we don't hear a lot about in the historical records. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. What was everyday life like for people on the goldfields? And what did that look like for those who weren't being written down as getting nice positions or having scandalous affairs? Now, obviously, there are some lovely letters here in the Hocken. I have read them from Goldfields miners writing home, but there's not that many, probably because people were too busy doing the hard work to try and get gold on the goldfields. Of course, some people were also illiterate. That doesn't help you, but many people were literate, just not writing heaps. And so we don't have that much in terms of these first-hand accounts. And the accounts that we do have are biased towards the middle classes, to people who had enough time to write stuff down. So we don't really know much about the everyday experience on the goldfields. And that's where archaeology comes in. So let me tell you a little bit about this project that I work on. It was started out by my collaborators, Hallie Buckley and Peter Pecci, who did an amazing job talking with a bunch of historic cemeteries management groups around the area to talk to them about their problems with heritage management and how Goldfields cemeteries are actually dealt with. And they found that a lot of the communities around central Otago and elsewhere had problems with unmarked graves in their cemeteries. And in particular, we started working first down in Milton, which is not central Otago, but is a goldfields kind of gateway, and then into Lawrence and later on in Drybread. And all of these places had large unmarked areas, which were a problem for the management of the cemetery, because if you don't know where people are buried, you don't know where it's safe to dig a hole to bury somebody else. And if you are doing that and you accidentally uncover human remains, it is a logistical nightmare. And so in essence, we were brought in to help manage these historic cemeteries. But after a lot of community consultation with descendant groups and other stakeholders, it was agreed that if we did find unmarked graves, we were able to study those people before reinterment, so we could find out who they were and mark their graves a bit more appropriately with information about them when they went back into the ground. So everybody I'm about to talk about has already been reburied. They are back in their graves, but with a little bit more marking and a little bit more information on them. And so I'm going to share some of their stories with you today. That's okay. So as a bit of background, this is what the first cemetery in Lawrence looks like, or looked like before we started our excavations. So this is not the Gabriel Street Cemetery that exists now, if you know Lawrence. This is on Ardrossan Street, and it was moved into private land in sometime in the late, I was about to say 1900s, in the 1990s, I think, on the assumption that everybody who was originally interred there had been moved in the 1860s to the new cemetery when this cemetery closed. And so as far as they were concerned, it was absolutely fine to sell this land because it wasn't a burial ground anymore. But when the current landowner decided to do some work on that land, he needed archaeological authority because it had once been a burial ground. And so just in case, we went along to check. Unfortunately for the landowner, what we found was that nobody had been moved in the 1860s. And so the colonial records were wrong. I suspect people went, you know what, it's easier to move the gravestones than move all the people. So they just moved those over. And so the landowner discovered that he had 25 people buried in his back garden. And so this is exactly the kind of context where archaeologists can be quite helpful, because not only can we make sure that everybody has been excavated properly, we can also reinter them in the Gabriel Street Cemetery, which is a cemetery still, so that's where they are now, and find out a bit more about these people so that their unmarked graves can become marked graves. So the issues of cemetery management are many and varied, but archaeology can help out with this and also help descendant communities to connect with their ancestors. So I've already mentioned that we are working in 3 different places: St. John's, Milton. So that's on Back Road out behind the main road, if you are aware of where Milton is. This was going to be the main cemetery for Milton until the gold rush happened, and then the whole of the settlement got moved towards central Otago, and so it got left on its own a wee bit. Ardrossan Street, which is the one I just told you about, and the new cemetery, Gabriel Street in Lawrence, have 2 areas. So the Chinese section is completely unmarked or has markings that have no relation to where the graves are nowadays. So we were asked by the Chinese community to investigate there. And Drybread Cemetery, which is this beautiful cemetery I used as my title slide, which is run by a trust nowadays and is still very active. So descendant groups are buried there still and has multiple unmarked areas as well. So what can we do as archaeologists? Well, specifically, I'm a bioarchaeologist, which means that I work with skeletons. So instead of reading about people, I work with people. Their skeletal remains particularly. But what we do is quite similar. So when historians read a document, they're thinking about it in terms of kind of historiography, the kinds of ways that you read history and break it down into little bits. For people, we can create what we call osteobiographies, or biographies of people from their bones. So people's bones are different. Your bones are different to my bones for a number of different reasons. And we're trying to kind of recognize those differences and reconstruct who those people were. So some of the basic things we can do are we can look at evidence for whether a person was biologically male or biologically female. And those are differences in the shape of your bones relating to childbirth mostly, or your ability to give birth. We can look at changes related to growth and also degeneration. I've passed the age now where my bones are now just degenerating. And so we look at signs of degeneration that happen at predictable times to figure out how old someone was. You can just measure different bones to figure out how tall someone was, right? All of these basic things give you an impression of what a person might have looked like, might have sort of been like to talk to face to face. But we can also go a bit deeper than that. So we can look at things like evidence for disease, and some diseases can be diagnosed from the changes that they leave on the skeleton. We can look at things like stress, and by stress I mean like malnutrition / massive scale illness, not, oh, I'm feeling a bit worried today. That won't usually change your bones, but malnutrition will, and so will big illnesses, and particularly they change your teeth if you're developing your teeth during those periods. And we can look at things like trauma. Now in the Goldfields, this is a big thing, right? Lots of people are involved in quite serious forces coming down upon them. And so looking for signs of fractures and things like that can tell us a bit about life experience too. And this is the bit that people tend to go, oh no, you're not going to talk to me about chemistry, are you? I am, but I'm going to tell you the cool stuff about it. So this is my area. And so I'm an expert in looking at chemical signals within your bones and teeth to reconstruct your life. Everything you do, everything you eat, everything you drink, everything you breathe in is being taken into your body, into your bloodstream, and locked into your tissues if they're forming at that time. And so I can look at the chemistry of your bones and your teeth to reconstruct things like where you were living. So the rocks that you live on, that you eat your food off, they leave signals in your bones. So we can match your chemical signals to the place that you're from, the water source that you were using. Your diet leaves changes in your bones. So things like the amount of meat that you eat, the amount of seafood that you eat, whether you're on a vegetarian diet. I can't say, oh, you had a banana for breakfast, but I can say overall, you didn't seem to like fish very much, or you couldn't get your hands on that. Even sickness, when you're sick, when you're really sick, your body starts to consume its own tissues to kind of get enough energy in to deal with that sickness. We see that in chemical spikes in certain tissues. And we can look at things like poisons or drugs that you might have been taking in. And on the Goldfields, mercury is a big one, because mercury was used to extract gold from the gravels that were being put into sluices. So all of these things together, I hope you can see, help us to build a picture of loads of different aspects of a person's life experience. And little by little can help us to tell their life stories. So that's what I'm going to do for the last bit of this talk, is to tell you some stories of some of the people that I have had the privilege of working with, so that their stories aren't lost anymore. And now you will know them and other people will know them. So it's a bit hidden by the Zoom, but I'm going to start with the story of somebody from Ardrossan Street, so that I think it'll be all right. So that earliest cemetery from Lawrence. So like I said, this is the cemetery that was supposed to have been exhumed and moved, and this is the lower part of that hill picture that I showed you before. And as you can see, all those cuts there are all of the unmarked graves that we found, and there were many more going up the hill past where this picture is taken. Oh no! And we're back. So our team excavated there between 2018 and 2019. We did a couple of seasons because there turned out to be a lot of people. And there were 25 people there, like I said. It was a really haphazard cemetery, so kind of classic for an area where people are not focused on infrastructure, they are focused on getting gold. And so we found that the coffins that were there were very simple. The interments were very haphazard. They weren't in pretty lines. They were very variably deep. So some of them were only about this far below the surface, whereas others were, you're kind of 6 foot. And that's probably because the rock there was so hard. Even us digging it when people had been dug it before, we found it tricky. I can't even imagine how difficult it was for the first people. We found pickaxe marks down all the sides of the grave cuts, whereas normally you'd have to use a spade to get in there with their rock hammers. So I think that's probably why they moved the cemetery, because they were just finding it so hard to dig that they decided to go somewhere a bit easier. I'm going to introduce you to burial 8. Now, I know that this is being filmed, so I've taken out pictures of the actual burials from this presentation because they're very sensitive images. So hopefully I got them all. So this is my artist's impersonation of skeleton burial 8. So from that kind of basic stuff that I told you about, we managed to figure out that he would have stood about 5'4". From his DNA, we know that he was European. So a European miner buried in a plain coffin made from native wood. And he was amazing because he had preserved hair, a woolen shirt, his woolly socks went up to his knees. The preservation on the Goldfields is amazing. And if anybody's into textiles, come chat to me because we found a lot of textiles. They've all been reburied now, but I think they're beautiful. So in his teeth, and this is just a kind of schematic diagram of what teeth tend to look like, you can see hopefully up there in the enamel that there are a number of kind of dark lines running through it. So each one of those dark lines is a period where the enamel forming didn't form very well due to stress instances. Hopefully you can see there's quite a lot. And so he has massively slowed enamel formation between 4 and 6 years of age, which means that was a time period that was really turbulent for him, where he wasn't able to get enough things into his body in order to produce enamel properly. The evidence that I have from his bones and teeth indicate from his isotopes, the kind of chemical signals that I'm looking at, and the strontium in his bones and teeth is consistent. I'll just move over here by this mouse. With an origin, kind of unhelpfully, in any of these kind of lime green areas. So it's not a precise art, but hopefully you can see that there are a number of areas in the sort of middle of the UK that he could be from. You can also look at his diet through time. This is a graph that shows a couple of other elements that we look at, isotopes that we look at. All I want you to notice is that his diet changes between childhood and adulthood. You get this shift, and then about here, he gets this big shift downwards, about 5 months before death. So those are times of dietary change. One of them is probably consistent with him moving to New Zealand, and the other one indicates some kind of massive shift happened to him a wee bit before death. He lost part of his left cheekbone, so you can't quite see it in this picture, but there's a bit missing over here. Completely. He also had arthritis in his neck and a bit of infection going on in his skull and face. So what we think happened to him is that sometime before death, because it has healed, is that he had a massive trauma to his face. He wouldn't have been able to eat solid food with the break here in his face. And so we think that possibly what would happen in that instance is he would have been put on a liquid diet. Like Bovril, if you grew up with Bovril, I know that I got the tail end of that. My mum's from Yorkshire, get the Bovril down you, when you're sick. And so we think that that's a possible reason for that dietary change. And he would have needed ongoing assistance with eating and communication. So again, that kind of support mechanism on the Goldfields is becoming evident in this person's story, which I think is really cool. So putting all of that together, we get this impression of a man who's sort of middle-aged, who's moved over from somewhere in England, probably, towards the end of his childhood, early adulthood, experiences a massive scale trauma. And one of my collaborators, Hallie, her lead theory is that he got kicked in the face by a horse, because that's one of the ways that we see this kind of traumatic injury in the modern day. A focus to the face is quite rare. And so experiences this large scale kind of life-changing injury, but is cared for by his mates on the Goldfields, cared for by medical care on the Goldfields, recovers from that to die a few months later, but potentially from something completely unrelated. All right, so that's GA8 even. I would like to move us now over to Gabriel Street Cemetery. So this is the Chinese portion of Gabriel Street Cemetery. It's designated the Chinese portion. It's down here in these trees. You can see there's a few grave markers, but not very many. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone buried there was Chinese. People who were marginalized in any way were buried in the Chinese section. When we dug in this area here, where you can see maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 grave markers, we actually found 25 unmarked graves, but only 9 of them were occupied because, as you may or may not know, the Chinese on the Goldfields didn't want to be buried on the Goldfields. So they paid into exhumation schemes through their time on the Goldfields. And after death, they were buried initially on New Zealand land and then exhumed a few years later. Their bones were cleaned off and they were sent back to China in order to be buried in home soil. And so we think it's pretty awesome that we have nice evidence that this was happening on a large scale in Lawrence. Not all of those people would have reached China again. So one of the exhumation missions with the SS Ventnor as its ship sank off the Hocken harbour and never made it home. But one of them would have been successful. So those who are left behind represent either people who weren't from the right clan groups to pay into the exhumation schemes, or they didn't have the money to pay into exhumation schemes, or they didn't have the inclination. They liked it better in New Zealand and didn't want to go home. So let me introduce you to one of them. So burial 7 that we found in Gabriel Street was a middle-aged man, again about 5'4". His teeth are really worn, like down to stubs in most places. And so in terms of dental care and dental hygiene, he wasn't having a great time of it. Loads of cavities, impacted wisdom teeth. Don't know about you, but when I had wisdom teeth trouble in the modern day, I didn't enjoy it. Back in these times, there's really nothing that could be done about it. So, and we know that he was Chinese because he has an East Asian mitochondrial DNA haplogroup. So his mother was of Chinese ancestry, and therefore he was. And he has a lot of items of material culture, so artifacts with him that represent his Chinese heritage. So up the top there is what we found in his breast pocket. Doesn't look like much there, but in life it would have had bamboo teeth, so it was a comb. And on the handle of it, which doesn't show up very well in photographs, was a dragon carving, which is a traditional symbol of prosperity. And then up by his head, he had a threepenny bit dated 1887. So we know that his burial was sometime around or after then. So, and it's quite traditional in Chinese funerals to offer money with the dead in order for them to pay their way into the afterlife. So we think this is a classic example of Chinese funeral culture. So what do we know about him? Well, even more so than our Europeans on the Goldfields, he had huge amounts of stresses during his childhood. And this is not surprising to us. It's the same with every Chinese individual that we have excavated. Their experience during childhood was hugely stressful. And that's probably due to the time period that they grew up in and the place they were from. So most Chinese on the Goldfield were from Guangdong province, which was seriously affected by the Opium Wars. And rural China was extremely poverty-stricken at this time period. We also know from skeletal evidence on his legs that he had a recent infection that he was suffering from at the time that he died. But probably a more pressing concern to him was the fact that around his time of death, he fractured the neck of his femur, which in the modern day, we only see in car accidents. It takes a lot of force to fracture your femur. In this time period, again, something like a carriage accident could cause that, or an earthfall, so a cave-in of your diggings could cause that as well, if it all landed on there. We know where he was from because Guangzhou has incredibly characteristic isotopic values, and so he plots very nicely in amongst the Guangzhou granite values. And his hair, so his hue, was preserved really nicely. And hair for me is a godsend because unlike your other tissues, which grow quite slowly or don't grow at all, in the case of bones when you're an adult, your hair is always growing. And it grows centimetre by centimetre, month by month, until you cut it off or until time of death, if you are one of the people in my sample. So if I look, for instance, at the bottom of my hair here, I'm looking at about 2 years ago. If I look up here, I'm looking at right now. So the end of my hair here would still tell you that I gave birth around this time period. And so if I look at somebody's hair like this, I can look month by month up to their time of death, which is how we know from that previous person that they changed their diet about 5 months before death. And this person has a massive shift in diet about 8 months before death, where he suddenly stops being able to get seafood in his diet. And previous to that, he'd been eating seafood all the time. And so we think that that might be when he moved inland to central Otago, either from a different goldfield or from China in general. So potentially he hadn't been on the goldfields very long before his time of death. So again, we have this image of a man who has left his homeland, but still has incredibly strong cultural ties to his homeland in the form of all the artifacts that he's wearing, in the form of his hairstyle, and his beautiful clothes, which I didn't mention, but moves to New Zealand, potentially doesn't stay on the goldfields for very long before meeting an accident and meeting his demise. They're not very cheery stories, I'll admit, but it is mostly because the people who stay on the goldfields in the cemeteries are the people who probably didn't have the most strike-it-rich stories and move out again. But this was the reality for the majority of people that went to the goldfields. So the last person that I want to talk to you about, well, people, are people from dry bread. So dry bread is not from the initial rush at Tuapeka. It's one of the Dunstan rush sites, so a little bit further north, and dates to about 1863. So this is the cemetery. As you can see, in between the marked graves, there are lots of areas where there's just grass, and we didn't know whether there were people buried there or not. And a lot of these blank areas had been reserved by members of the community nowadays. So when we were digging, people were looking over our shoulders going, there better not be anyone in there because that's my one. And some people were disappointed. The original township at Dry Bread is now lost, so there's not a town in there anymore. It's up kind of north of Omakau, St. Bathans kind of area, if you're interested in going to visit. It was a canvas town. It was pretty bustling back in the day. The cemetery records are really patchy because a lot of them were lost in a fire in the 1930s. So we went and we looked in all the blank areas to see if we could fill in the gaps for some people. And in this one just up here, we found it was occupied, much to the upset of somebody who thought that it was theirs. They've had to get a different one now because these people are back in their holes. So this two adjacent plots, D1 and D2, so dry bread 1 and dry bread 2. As you might be able to see on this one, this is not the skeletons, this is the tops of the plots where the coffins are. And you can see this rusty patch here is a coffin plate, which was partially but not completely readable, much to our frustration. So we can see that the person in D2 was 68 years old when they died, but we couldn't read their name. In D1, we had a middle-aged male. D2 is a female. And D1 had evidence of a really long-standing infection, which hadn't progressed too far when he died, but definitely existed. We'll come back to that in a minute. So let's talk about D2. So she's an older female, much older than the male that she's buried next to. She has a healed fracture of her right forearm. Obviously, this is not her X-ray, but the ulna here, just close to the elbow, had been snapped clean in two at some point in the past, but it healed really well, almost perfectly. So there was just a little bump left there that we could see that she'd had good medical intervention to set that well and for her to come right again. She's also a habitual pipe smoker. We don't think about women in these days as pipe smoking, but almost all the women we've found in our studies have got pipe facets. So if you use a clay pipe long enough, it wears a hole in your teeth from where you held it. And so almost all the women have that, and she certainly did. She also has a really widespread disfiguring infection. So this is not her skull, but it's very similar. Her skull has sort of holes throughout it, which would have been echoed by the soft tissue on top of them in terms of sores and things like that. We'll come back to that in a minute. My analysis shows that she was probably from Cornwall. There's only a couple of places that she could have come from, up here in the Lake District in England and down here in Devon, Cornwall type area. That's not a massive surprise. On the Goldfields, there were loads of people from Cornwall coming from the tin mining industry, which was declining, moving to the kind of booming gold mining industry. And you can see in the papers of the time period, there's a lot of, everyone should come to Otago because the gold is way better than the tin was in Cornwall. The last thing that we've looked at with her is this mercury exposure. And I've looked at this in the Lawrence sample as well. So I'm really interested in mercury and the amount of mercury that people were taking in, because it's not something that we tend to think about, but it was ubiquitous across the Goldfields. So mercury was used as an element to put into your sluice. Gold has a really strong affinity for mercury. So as you run gold-bearing gravels through your sluice, you put some mercury in, the mercury bonds to the gold. Mercury is really heavy. It drags the gold out of suspension and down to the bottom of your sluice. Great, now you've got all your gold, but it's attached to the mercury. So what you need to do, get your hands in there, fish out your mercury, pop it over here on a pan over the top of a fire, evaporate the mercury, and you're left with gold. Great. And in all the steps of that process, you are handling mercury, you are breathing in mercury vapors, and exposing yourself to something that we all know now is really toxic. So I'm really interested in how much mercury was on the Goldfields and how it was affecting people. And what we found when we looked at the people of Lawrence is that everybody had elevated levels of mercury in their system, even the babies, which means that it was in the water and was in the environment. People who were likely mining had what we call subclinical exposure. So they weren't getting enough to start to really manifest as symptoms, but it wasn't healthy. It was about 10 times the level that the World Health Organization suggests is all good nowadays. And there was one person with very elevated mercury, kind of like a woman from Dry Bread. So when we look through her hair at her mercury exposure, so the World Health Organization says anything under 1 part per million is fine. And as you can see, her mercury exposure is pretty high all the way through her hair strand. But about 4 months before death, she gets about 100 times the recommended dose of mercury into her system. So this is as though you had grabbed gold out of the sluice and just eaten it, which is unlikely to be what she was doing. Much more likely that she was taking a medicine that contained mercury, which was still quite regularly prescribed during these days because they didn't know the issues with mercury. And so calomel is a mercury pill, which was prescribed for a lot of different things, some of which you didn't need to prescribe anything for, e.g. hysteria. So if you were a woman and you were being a bit hysterical, have a bit of mercury, that'll calm your wound down. But the most common thing that calomel was prescribed for was syphilis. And syphilis is really consistent, beautiful image to pop up. Syphilis is really consistent with the skeletal evidence that we have from her. And so what we think these two are evidence of is a man and wife, the man who had early stage syphilis but died before it got too bad, and his wife who carried on with that syphilis until it progressed to the point where it was really disfiguring her before her death. So draw your own conclusions from where that came from in the first place, but there was a lot of syphilis on the Goldfields, and it wasn't talked about very much, but we have really nice evidence of it in terms of the skeletal evidence from these two people. But what I think it is kind of a testament to in the case of D2 is the resilience of these women on the Goldfields. I think that having caught a disease when you were probably about middle-aged and surviving to old age with a disease that was disfiguring in a place where there was little to no medical care, but you just carried on puffing your pipe, sitting on your doorstep, and kept on keeping on, I think is an amazing testament to the lives and the willpower of these people of colonial Otago. So these are the stories that don't get told. They're the less glamorous stories. They're the kind of sad stories, and they're the stories the bones tell when the historical records give us facts and figures. The bones tell us the kind of hardships and emotions that people went through on the Goldfields, and I think really helped us to identify with these people. So that's where I'm going to stop. What a perky way to finish. Yeah, there have been loads of people involved in this study, and I am by no means the lead investigator, but I do love talking about these stories. So hopefully you have a new appreciation for what the people on the Goldfields might have been experiencing. Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's
fascinating. I'm just wondering, does anybody have questions for Charlotte?
Yeah.
Yes, Claire.
With the unmarked graves, but the headstones would have been moved, did you find enough evidence to be able to match many of them with the headstones that had nothing under them? And they ended up with the right headstone in the new cemetery?
We have identified some people by name. They were people who didn't have gravestones in the initial cemeteries. So we've given them new headstones, or new headstones are being made for them. The ones in the Chinese section, they actually don't have very much information on their headstones in terms of who they were. So we have collaborators in the Chinese community who have been for decades trying to restore those to the correct positions. And what they have decided to do is move them to the places where people have been reinterred, but we're not sure still where those individuals are.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Can I ask a couple of questions? I find that whole the hair thing really interesting. So what happens if you were doing it now with people who we do such a lot to our hair now? How will that affect, you think, in 50 years' time? Picking up like us and trying to look, because how would you account for that?
So it won't affect things like the big trace elements. Right. That's not normally a part of things like hair dye or hair treatments and things like that. So if you were taking mercury, I'd still be able to tell. Yeah. Things like the dietary signals might change because that's from things like carbon and nitrogen that I look at. And so there you have hair dyes that are made of those same things. And so probably what I would do is say, don't trust any of that in 50 years' time.
Because even our diet, people take so many supplements now that must also eat.
It does a bit, yeah. I think broadly, so we use this in forensics as well. And broadly, even though people are interfering with their diet a little bit, you can still tell the main dietary components because however many supplements you take is never more than, the fish you were eating or the wheat you were eating and things like that. But yeah, hair dyes could just stuff you around. Yeah.
Jeanette, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. That was been really fascinating. Your job has got many components to it. What's the form of training that you've been doing? You have so many skills.
My job is a a function of my indecision as an undergraduate. So I have 2 undergraduate degrees, one in archaeology and one in geology, minoring and chemistry. And then I have a PhD where I was supervised in both of those areas. And so essentially I found a career where I could marry the 2 things that I love, which are people's stories and chemistry. My historical knowledge is purely a function of me just loving reading archival things. So I have little to no training in that area.
Thank you.
Lorraine?
Were there any children's graves? Did you find children there?
We did, yes. There aren't many, if I'm honest. There are more graves than there are remains. Children's bones don't preserve super well because they're not as mineralized as adult bones, so they're still kind of forming. So they're much more likely to be destroyed in the burial environment. But yes, we did find a few children, some of which were only represented by their teeth and their hair. So we do have information from them. That's why we know that the mercury was everywhere, because it was in the kids too. And I have colleagues who really focus on those children to look at their life experiences and things as well. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was talking about mercury. I was watching a thing on the History Channel last week about the first emperor of China.
Oh, yeah.
And apparently he wanted to live forever, so someone gave him, one of the doctors gave him these pills that contained mercury, and instead of living forever, I think that sort of hastened his death.
Yes, yeah, it would. It's quite quick, is mercury, if you give it in the right dosage. Yeah, I think, is he the one that's also the other archaeologists in the room,
Yes,
like
the
buried with the rivers of mercury on the,
yes.
yeah. So yeah, mercury, I mean, it's an amazing element, right? It's a metal that flows, so you can see why it held a lot of fascination for people back in the day. Yeah.
Have you been able to reunite family, distant family members without you also found things that they don't know?
Yes, we have done in some instances, and we're quite careful to try and trace any family members when we identify people. And so we don't tell any of the stories of the people without permissions. So yes, we found, so in Milton, for example, we were able to identify the town doctor from his unmarked grave, and he didn't have descendants that survived, but he had great nieces and nephews, off to the side people, and they didn't know much about him, but we were able to kind of look at the records from his bones and marry them to local newspapers to, it's another sad story, show that his substance abuse was what led to his death. And they were very keen that we actually tell that story to people so that people would know the kind of long history of substance abuse in New Zealand, because sometimes I think we can think that's quite a modern thing. Yeah.
I was just asked about the Chinese protocol for sending bones home. So is that exactly why they buried them? So that the flesh would be removed, so that they never treated them and sent them back as bodies. They were always sent back as bones.
Yeah, sometimes they would send them back as living people. So if you were an old person and you thought you might be on your way out, you could go back on one of the exhumations. But yeah, if you were dead, you were skeletonized in the country, and then your bones were scraped down, wrapped in calico, put in a lead box, and sent off again, so that they were perfectly clean by the time they got to China. Yeah.
And just how long does that process take? Like it's
Oh,
depending on the climate.
it depends on the climate. Yes. So the exhumations that happened were in 1883 and 1902, I want to say. So most people would have been buried for about 10 years-ish before they were exhumed. But skeletonization can happen in a year in the right climate. So
some of the bones may be on the water off of the Hocken.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yes, I think only a few of the bones that were on the Ventnor washed back on shore. So most of them are still on the Ventnor or in the Hokianga harbour, yeah. But the Chinese community are very clear that they want them to stay there. They don't want any rescue missions.
What approximate causes of death?
Tricky because most things that would, sometimes it's doable. For instance, that person that had a femoral break, that would sever your femoral artery. So that was probably cause of death there. But in most instances, it's very hard to say a person died for this. So a lady with syphilis, for example, syphilis will kill you, but she might have had a heart attack that I wouldn't be able to see skeletally in the meantime as well. So we try to say, you know, these were the illnesses or the infections that were affecting them, but we usually can't tell cause of death unless there's a very obvious like trauma, something like that. But that does help us to search up people. So we did manage to identify one person from the Milton sample who had a lot of trauma to their head and part of their femur, and we're able to match that with a coroner's report for an individual from the time period in order to identify that person. So that kind of thing helps us, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why they died.
Is there an end date to this project?
So everybody has,
more
oh gosh, no, well,
somewhere else?
it sort of depends on, so every excavation that we do requires an awful lot of consultation beforehand and chats with the Historic Places Trust, chats with the Public Health Authority and things like that. So before we embark on anything, it takes about 2-3 years to set up the project. So at the moment, we've been asked by places like Waipori and other areas. I think Clyde have also chatted to us, but we haven't set anything in motion yet for further excavations, but it is possible.
I've got a question or two.
Sure.
So early on in your talk, we had one of the newspaper clippings, and I can't remember if it was to do with Jane Wilson, but it was definitely one of those sly groggers. Was selling something called Shandygaff. Yeah. What's that?
Great question. I think pretty variable depending on where you were getting it from. So usually it contains a form of whiskey as well as a form of beer. But different places had different recipes and nobody was particularly clear on what it might contain at any given place. So yeah, general catch-all term for a spirit plus beer. Spirit and beer.
Okay. And the other comment I just had is, as an archivist, like letters from people on the Goldfields, many of them, because most of these, many people were European, or people who were writing letters would presumably be European. They would have gone back to the UK.
Yes,
And I've always wondered what happened to all those letters that all our migrants wrote back to the UK, because very occasionally they came to New Zealand with subsequent migration of the family. But there must have been a lot. But,
and so part of something that I'm trying to develop at the moment is a kind of here and there kind of thing to with some universities in the UK who are interested in what made people leave, and us who are interested in you know what happened to the people when they came, to try and get that going, because I mean obviously the archives over there I don't know much about. I haven't been over, but they have a great handle on them. Oh yeah, I mean obviously,
but I haven't really found evidence, like looking at archives, like evidence of letters from migrants to New Zealand, but it may be that they're kind of a little bit hidden, perhaps in collections of family papers that are in archives there. That
would be something that would I'd really love to explore as well, because you've got a few here in the Hocken of people who wrote home and then the letters were brought back to New Zealand. But it's quite frustrating
all the time. And I would love to ask you about textiles, but we're probably running out of time. So
I'll come and talk about textiles another time.
Yeah. So yeah, just thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to Lorraine now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Charlotte, as a very amateur archaeologist, I'm very envious of you being a professional archaeologist. And I have learnt a great deal from what you've told us today. It's unbelievable how much you can tell from some bones lying around that have been there for a long time. So I think everybody here would like to thank you enormously for coming and talking to us. And maybe one day you'll come and talk to us about the textiles. So we'd like to give you this.
Oh, thank you.
And we'd like to thank you very much indeed.